In education in general, we always talk about start with the learner, know your learners. Haven't we always done this? What is this theme of personalisation with intercultural language learning all about?
This approach really requires a deeper level of engaging with the learners, I think, and engaging with them in terms of who they are linguistically and culturally. So really delving inside what they know, what they bring to their learning, what kinds of prior experiences, and picking up on the idea of interpretation. What are the interpretive lenses that they have in coming to learn a new language and culture? And so because we're asking them to make a bridge or make a move towards another linguistic and cultural system, we actually need to know what that starting position looks like itself, absolutely. So that we can begin to graft on the new language and culture and begin that expansion work, because this really is a project in expanding identity and expanding who learners can be and giving them new repertoires of being in relation to where they're starting from. So I think for me that's...
The starting point is really consideration of their situatedness, where they are situated, where they live, where their home is, linguistically and culturally speaking.
Right. And really also consider who do they want to be in learning this, because I know in my own teaching that I've had some students outright reject the notion of being Indonesian. And in fact, if I think of one of my PhD cases where there was a student who was very strident in saying, because the teacher was trying to explain a certain way of expressing something, and he said, well, I don't know. He was asking about how do you say my street is dead? And he was in the country and he was trying to say that this is a very isolated area. How do I say my street is dead? And she was trying to explain, well, you can't really use the word dead, and Indonesian doesn't really have this sense of isolation in the same way. When you have 250 million people, there are very few places that are dead in the same sense. And she said, well, you really just have to think like an Indonesian. And he very quickly said, well, I am not Indonesian. And he was marking the fact that this was not how he saw himself. And he really probably had little intention of wanting to see it that way. So I think they're awkward moments, they're difficult moments for us because we want everyone to love our languages, but we actually have to recognise that sometimes they don't affiliate with it, or they don't to begin with, perhaps. And so they need to be able to have some sense of what kind of connection they want with the language, and then we need to provide the opportunities for them to explore what those ways of being might be.
There's also the recognition that students bring multiple identities to the classroom. So they may be a Vietnamese background, they may also be a child in a 3-generation family living together. They may also be in the local football club. They may also have memberships of other kinds. In other words, it's recognising the multiple memberships that our students bring, and therefore with that their multiple identities, but also that none of this is static, because they are continuing to build on their own trajectory of personal experiences, and it's through the eyes of that experience that they make sense of what's going on in the classroom. And I think that sense of personalisation is, the recognition of the multiplicity of the one person is something that we tend to forget. It's just too easy to say, oh yeah, he's Vietnamese, and not recognise all the other memberships that person actually brings. So what do you think are the implications of this notion of the personal as part of our intercultural work? What are the implications of that for teachers?
I think notions of these pretend scenarios where we position students in certain ways, we really need to think about, because I think often the students are not wanting to be the roles that we're assuming that they could be, and communicative language teaching very much focused on that. And so I think within an intercultural approach, we're actually asking them to be themselves a lot more, and to be authentic in who they are and who they can be and who they want to be. And so I think as teachers we need to think about those opportunities, the opportunities we design for students, and really consider who they are in those tasks and experiences.
It reminds me of a little piece of research that I did in Malaysia, with Malaysian teachers, and it was really interesting to see the responses of the Malaysian students to the same examination questions as the students in Australia were also responding to. And obviously I analysed all of the responses, and there was this real mixture of the students saying, they needed to write a letter to an editor, and they wrote it with an Australian address. But then, of course, in the body of the letter, they were talking about villages and this bicycle accident and so on in the village. And I recognised from his response that you can't ask people to leave their own language and culture behind. This letter, his response had all the markings of his Malaysian culture as he was trying to do this examination response in English.
Is this the one where the task was to write a letter of complaint?
Yes, that's right. And it brought into play the different cultures around the idea of complaint, and that in the Malaysian way, you don't provide a full frontal complaint. And so he was trying to move around and force his language into a complaint which culturally did not sit comfortably with him. When I interviewed the teachers and said, how do you prepare your students for this examination? They said, don't be Malaysian. The key advice that they give their students is, don't be Malaysian.
Don't be yourselves.
Don't be yourselves. You can't, if it's an English exam by an Australian examination authority, the only thing you can do is try to be other than yourself. Forego your own identity in the hope of being successful. The scripts showed, the responses showed, that the students can't leave themselves behind. They are still holding that pen. And so this raised for me the really crucial question of who it is that we ask our students to be, how we position them. I wanted to stop immediately and give the teacher a lesson on maybe taking an intercultural stance instead of saying don't be Malaysian, to say, well, find a space in between the two that you are most comfortable with. It is an intercultural process of communication, and you need to find your comfort zone within that. That would have been a different way of doing it. And so in traditional language learning, there just isn't enough attention to positionality, how we are positioning the students, what that positioning actually means in terms of their responses, teasing out the responses, inviting the students themselves to stand back from the response that they've made. I would have given that student his text and said, look, you're saying that you're in Australia, there are these other markings that show you are somewhere else. How do you want to deal with this? And then it becomes an opportunity for learning, which of course was not possible in the examination, but in a learning experience it certainly is.